You know, it's pretty incredible when you think about it, how a single, ordinary day on the calendar can actually tell this huge, sprawling story about America. Today, we're going to zoom in on one of those days, February 1st, and trace a single thread that connects a 1644-year-long fight for freedom. It's a story told through a song that pretty much became the soundtrack for a war,
A law that was supposed to completely remake the country, and a protest that lit a fire under an entire movement. So how in the world does one single date connect all of this? That's the big question, right? And the answer, well, it reveals so much about the long, winding, and sometimes messy path of American history. All right, let's dive in and see how it all unfolds.
Our story kicks off right here, way back in the middle of the Civil War. It's February 1st, 1862, and a magazine called The Atlantic Monthly just published something that would become way more than just a poem. It would become an anthem for the entire Union cause.
Wow. Those are some powerful words, right? That's the beginning of Julia Ward Howe's Battle Hymn of the Republic. And when this was published, it hit like a lightning bolt. It just perfectly captured what the Union side felt it was fighting for. But the story of how these words even came to exist is, well, it's pretty remarkable.
So you got to understand where she was coming from. Julia Ward Howe is visiting Washington, D.C., and she's surrounded by the war effort, but she feels completely powerless. Her husband? Too old to enlist. Her son's? Way too young. She's got a toddler to look after. She's just watching all these other people contribute and thinking, what can I possibly do? And then, inspiration strikes. But it's not some grand moment. It's a bunch of little things. First, she's out touring Union Army camps, and she hears the soldiers singing this really popular, kind of gritty marching tune called John Brown's Body. Later that day, a friend just casually says to her, hey, you should write some better, more inspiring words for that song. The idea stuck. That night, she wakes up before sunrise, and the verses are just there, pouring into her head. She jumps out of bed and scribbles them all down in the near darkness.
And this right here, this is the verse that changes everything. It's the one that took a brutal political conflict and turned it into a righteous, holy war. It told every Union soldier that their sacrifice wasn't just for politics, it was a sacred mission to make people free. It gave the whole war this profound moral purpose. Okay, so let's hit fast forward. It's now exactly 3 years later, to the day. And that spirit from the hymn, that idea of dying to make men free, is about to be carved directly into the U.S. Constitution.
This is a huge moment. On February 1st, 1865, President Abraham Lincoln signs the joint resolution for the 13th Amendment. And this wasn't just some new rule. This was a fundamental rewrite of what America was. It officially abolished slavery. But it also did something totally new. For the very first time, an amendment didn't just limit the government's power, it actually gave Congress the power to enforce it.
I mean, can you even imagine what that room must have felt like? The day it passed in the House, the place just exploded. People were screaming, cheering, waving handkerchiefs. One lawmaker literally wrote that he felt like he'd been born into a new life. It was just this moment of pure, absolute joy and hope.
But here's the tough part of the story. That incredible hope, it didn't last. The promise that was made in 1865 started to fall apart in just a decade or so when Reconstruction failed. For almost 100 years, the dream of that day went unfulfilled, which just set the stage for a whole new kind of fight, for a whole new generation.
And that brings us to our next stop on the timeline, our third February 1st. We're now in 1960, Greensboro, North Carolina. The fight for freedom is still going on, but the battlefield looks totally different. It's not a field covered in mud, it's the lunch counter at a department store.
It all started with just 4 guys, 4 college freshmen, David Richmond, Franklin McCain, Ezel Blair Jr., and Joseph McNeil. They made a plan, they walked into a Woolworth's, sat down at the lunch counter that was for whites only, and they politely asked for a cup of coffee. It was such a simple act, but man was it courageous.
So that quiet protest? Yeah, it made a whole lot of noise, and fast. The very next day, they came back, but they weren't alone. And by the third day, the TV cameras were there, and the number of students sitting at that counter had jumped to 60. The movement was just exploding.
You know, people talk about a single spark starting a fire. This was it. The Greensboro sit-in just ignited the entire South. Soon, students were doing the same thing everywhere, at pools, museums, libraries, you name it. And you know what? It worked. By that summer, the Greensboro Woolworths, losing a ton of money,
finally desegregated its lunch counter.
So the story could end there, right? A song, a law, a protest, a nice, neat arc. But it doesn't. As we get closer to our own time, the legacy of February 1st gets, well, a lot more complicated. It's not just a straight line of progress. It's full of celebration, but also tragedy and a lot of controversy.
Just look at how this one single day has been woven into our modern history in such different ways. In 1976, it becomes the first day of the first officially recognized Black History Month. But then, in 2023, it's a day of mourning, when the family of Tyree Nichols holds his funeral. And then you have 2026, where it becomes a flashpoint in this huge debate over how we even tell our own history.
And this really gets to the heart of the debate today. This all went down at Independence National Historical Park. There was this exhibit, right? It was all about the people George Washington enslaved. And its whole point was to explore that difficult paradox, a nation founded on freedom that was built by enslaved people. But a government directive came down, ordering historic sites to focus only on American greatness and achievements, so the exhibit was taken down. It's a perfect example of how the struggle over America's story is still very much alive.
Which brings us all the way back around, right back to where we started, with a song. We're now on February 1st, 2026 in Minneapolis, where a protest is happening inside a Target store.
Remember these lines? The words that Julia Ward Howe scribbled down in the dark? The words that defined a war? The sound of that original struggle?
Okay, now listen to this. These are protesters in Minneapolis today. They're singing totally new words for a totally new fight. But that tune? Does it sound familiar? It should. It's the exact same melody as the Battle Hymn of the Republic. That rhythm from 164 years ago is still marching on.
So you see the thread, right? From a hymn in 1862 to a law in 1865, a sit-in in 1960, and now a protest chant in a Target. February 1st isn't just a date on the calendar, it's a living story. It shows us that this fight for freedom, it never really ends. The song just keeps going, which really makes you wonder, what's the next verse going to be?